The Road to War. Written and narrated by John Miro. Get more at servingworlds.com. 48. Padalecki and Willard charged down the hall, concentrating the fire from their rifles, the team's only 2 rifles, onto the legs of the mech standing by the door. Proving herself a crack shot, sparks flew from those legs before Padalecki ran out of ammo. Willard kept firing, but it was mostly cover fire as the 2 leaped behind the wreckage of the fallen scout mech. Lee followed down the hall, projecting a swirling blue shield of crysteel ahead of him. It was peppered almost instantly by rounds from the mech at the far end of the hall. The shield slowed its spin but had enough momentum to send the bullets flying into the walls instead of his own body. The barrage of fire ended abruptly when the scout mech staggered out into the center of the hall. Noelle appeared behind him, a length of pipe in her hand like a staff. Jake appeared on the far side of the mech wielding a matching pipe. They swung at it over and over, staggering the light mech and dancing from side to side before it could pin a bead on them with the guns mounted on either arm. They kept up the attack, running around the mech and landing blows, jumping powerfully off walls when the pilot finally managed to get its hands up to fire and hammering the limbs back down. But the mech took the blows and kept firing while fewer and fewer of Jake and Noelle's blows were connecting, and their feet were moving slower. Willard kept up a steady rate of fire until his clip ran dry too. The scout mech he'd been keeping busy was pushed up against the council door. All of its limbs sparked and popped, servo motors seized up, fluid spurting. The mech's pilot tried to split the seams, but damage to the system allowed the front halves of the scout mech only to part halfway. It was enough for the pilot, the name Shin was stenciled outside the mech, to draw her service pistol and fire through the gap. Blood sprayed from Willard's shoulder as he fell back behind the cover of the dead mech. Padalecki roared and pushed the inert combat chassis forward towards Shin's mech. She earned a bullet for her trouble, but when she fell, the mech she'd used as a shield fell against Shin's machine, and both tumbled to the ground, with the pilot trapped inside. Willard staggered over to the pieces of men across the corridor, digging through their remains for a pistol. Shin screeched as she fought against the half-open mech chassis trapping her inside. At the far end of the hall, Noelle cried out as her mech backhanded her and took her out of the fight. Jake got the pipe around its neck and pulled the small mech backwards. Small but mechanically assisted, its pilot obliged him and hammered Jake back against the wall. He dropped his pipe. He fell to the ground, senseless. The mech took 3 steps forward and kicked Noelle hard enough to send her into the other wall. Then Lee reached the end of the hall. He leaped over Noelle and sliced the mech's head off with a blade of crysteel, then bowled its still metal frame to the ground with the strength of his charge. He fell beside Jake and stumbled onto his side, struggling to get to his feet. He looked down, confused, suddenly weak, and saw blood dripping from his stomach, a consequence of the one bullet his shield hadn't stopped. Back in front of the council chamber, Shin shrieked again, the metal of her mech groaning along with her sounds, and then her roar changed, becoming victorious, hungry, angry and promising vengeance when she crawled out of the front of her mech suit. She stumbled forward and kicked Willard in the face. The blood-sticky gun he had recovered fell away. Panting, leering, Shin swayed to it, picked it up and turned, aiming for Willard's face.
"I'm gonna enjoy this so much."
Samin rose from behind her, grabbing her by the shoulder, batting her gun hand to the side, and driving the heel of her palm through Shin's nose, and Shin's nose into her brain. Boo! She limped on by before Shin's corpse crumpled to the floor. When the first shots were fired outside the council room, Vice Admiral Card fell apart in front of Ashland's eyes. He dropped to the ground, screaming after the first explosion. "Who's out there?" Card demanded. He was huddled against the wall opposite the door now, staring across the floor at Ashland.
"What did you do?"
Ashland's mouth opened, and, in response to another direct question, she found she could speak. "Nothing, Joseph. I did nothing. Did the noise frighten you?" She wasn't watching the council members when she spoke, but she heard someone titter. Card glared at the table, back at her, and wiped his wet cheeks, which were growing red. "What, from a couple of fireworks?" I made plenty of noise as governor on Reach, thank you very much." She laughed, her body breathing deeper now, at least, that the restriction to silence had been removed. "Really? The reports I read show you moved your office to the basement when the protests grew too big for your military to control." He opened his mouth to say something, but words eluded him. He shook his head, pinching his eyes to fight away a fresh batch of tears. "You weren't there. You don't know what I did." "No, Joseph," she agreed with him, using the distraction of conversation to see how much she could move. He'd commanded her to sit down, but there was some wiggle room there. She leaned forward. "If I had known what you did, if it's anything like what you're planning now, you would have faced a firing squad long ago." Something slammed against the door. Card cried out and hid his head. Ashland laughed aloud. "Stop that!" Card got to his feet. Ashland's voice infuriatingly obliged him and shut up. "You tell him to stay outside, not to come in." She smiled and climbed to her feet. "No, stop! What are you doing?" he screeched. "I said don't move!" "Networks are down, Joseph." She tapped at her own temple and then at the shattered round table. "How exactly do you expect me to tell them anything if I can't move?" She pointed to the display by the door. "I have to use the screen if you want me to tell them to stop from coming in." Card licked his lips. "No, stay right there." She smiled, despite her sudden inability to move her legs. "Come now, Joseph, you're not thinking straight," she said, her deep voice soaked with understanding. "How can you make any decisions at all if you don't know who's coming to kill you?" You have been listening to Reach, The Road to War. Written and narrated by John Miro. Music, All This by Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com. Hear more of the story at servingworlds.com. Thank you for listening.